In your book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, you introduce us to a rogues gallery of climate science deniers. How many of them have popped up in the Trump administration?
Oh, well, it's a veritable who's who in the world of climate change denial. I sometimes describe it as a climate change denial dream team is what Trump has basically put together. And, of course, Trump has relatively little to do with it. He's basically outsourced his entire administration to polluting interests like the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil, and they've made sure to get their folks into key positions like Scott Pruitt, who's the EPA administrator, was formerly the Attorney General of Oklahoma, and as Attorney General of Oklahoma, he ghost-wrote papers, government documents for fossil fuel interests, passing them off as official government documents. He's on record denying the reality of climate change, has connections with the Koch brothers. Then you've got Ryan Zinke at the Department of Interior, who is another climate change denier. You've got Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, who is our Secretary of State. And, of course, as CEO of ExxonMobil, he worked closely with Russia to try to get access to their untapped oil reserves. And, of course, the thing that got in the way of that was the sanctions, which the Trump administration has worked hard, as we know, and has potentially conspired with Russia to get rid of those sanctions so that they can tap that oil. Just today, there was an announcement that the new head of the USDA is a climate change denier, and the new Trump spokesman who's replacing Sean Spicer, Anthony Scaramucci, is also on record as a climate change denier. So again,
wow.
And that isn't a coincidence. That isn't a coincidence because it really is the Koch brothers and polluting interests like ExxonMobil who are running the show. Trump himself is just a puppet.
I was amazed that Sam Clovis at the USDA was appointed to be the chief official in charge of responding to climate change vis-a-vis our food supply.
Right.
So, no big deal.
Right, yeah.
And he was the guy who also brought Carter, I love to talk to Russian spies page onto the Trump team. And I have this feeling that it's kind of like a punishment almost, that he'd be the ambassador to France or something like that for delivering his home state. But he's actually been sent out to the USDA to deny climate change.
Right, it's like a Siberian outpost. Yeah. That's right. And national security, another example where climate change, just like food, climate change has a direct connection with national security. And here we've heard fallacies coming from the Trump administration like, we have more important things to worry about than climate change, like ISIS. Well, in fact, if you understand the origins of ISIS, you realize that climate change probably played a key role in creating this unprecedented drought in Syria that drove rural farmers into the city, creating increased competition and instability, which ultimately created conditions in which a terrorist organization like ISIS could arise and thrive. So, in fact, all of these other threats and challenges that we face, in many cases, are actually exacerbated by climate change.
Trump tried to frame this as an assault on American jobs in almost conspiracy theory-like terms. What was his argument for why this would cost us jobs, and what do you think of that argument? Yeah,
well, in Trump's case, it's dangerous to attribute malice to what can be better explained as ignorance, but those are advising him. And those, who are really guiding the policies, who are crafting the policies of the administration, which again are really associates of the Koch brothers and polluting interests, have used that cynical argument that it's supposedly about jobs when in fact it's plainly evident that the opposite is true. The rest of the world, China, India now, Europe, the European nations recognize that renewable energy is the great economic revolution of this century, and they're getting on board. And those countries that are getting on board in the renewable energy revolution are going to be the countries who lead economically this century. And instead, the Trump administration, the fossil fuel lobbyists who run the Trump administration have instead done everything they can to block progress on renewable energy, to keep us locked into this fossil energy source, fossil fuels, to the detriment of our economy, to the detriment of the American people. So there's a good chance that if the Trump administration is making an argument for doing something, just the opposite is likely true.
The president keeps fuming about how China is allowed to build all these coal plants and the United States is not because of the Paris Accord. What is he talking about?
Yeah, so again, if Trump and the Trump administration is saying something, then there's a good chance the opposite is true. In the case of China, that is 5-year-old rhetoric, outdated rhetoric. It's erroneous, it's false, it's an untruth. China is actually decommissioning coal-fired power plants now, and they are actually well ahead of the commitment that they made to the U.S. in the bilateral agreement between the Obama administration and China a couple of years ago. So ironically, China is doing much more than us. They are investing far more in renewable energy. In fact, they have flooded the global marketplace with inexpensive solar panels. They brought down prices for solar panels around the world. So that's a ruse. It's untruthful, and it's a talking point that's repeated because simply, an untruth that's repeated often enough too often becomes accepted as the truth, and that's what's going on here. What Trump is saying and what others who point to China to claim that they're not holding up their end of the bargain, it's just not truthful. The opposite is actually true. We're the ones now who are not holding up our end of the bargain.
If Trump is really going to come back into the Paris Agreement, what would that look like? I mean, it seems unlikely that he would simply re-sign up without some kind of concessions on the other side.
Yeah.
Is there any feasible path back in that would be acceptable to the other signatories?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In principle, actually, because it's a voluntary agreement, being back in the Paris Agreement simply amounts to saying, we're back in it. There's a good chance that we will meet our obligations under Paris, even in the absence of leadership by the White House or by congressional Republicans, because there's so much progress being made at the state level, at the municipal level. States like California, the entire West Coast, the New England states are ramping up renewable energy, introducing incentives for clean energy, and in the case of the West Coast states, putting in a cap-and-trade system to limit carbon emissions. So there is enough progress taking place that we may well meet our obligations under Paris, regardless of what Trump says. So, to some extent, when he said he was backing out of Paris, that was a hollow statement because, in fact, he doesn't really have much control over that, especially since it's a voluntary agreement. It was simply a matter of symbolism, and it conveyed to many of us here in the U.S., and it conveyed to the rest of the world, the notion that the Trump administration was going to do everything they could to block progress and to double down on fossil fuels and to eradicate incentives for renewable energy. And they are doing those things. They are trying to put that in place, but they just don't have enough influence over our economy, the economic machinery of our economy today to really make that much of a difference. So the flip side of that is it's very easy for him to say that we're back in Paris. It's a matter of him simply stating so. But you asked something else which is important. He's also said he wants to renegotiate. Well, that's ridiculous, right? This is a treaty that was signed by nearly 200 countries after years of negotiation. The idea that he could just somehow renegotiate unilaterally this treaty with the remaining nearly 200 nations around the world who signed on to it is silly.